A struggling rancher bought a girl deemed too wild for any man, never knowing she was born to ride beside him. The saloon doors crashed open, and the air, thick with stale beer and sweat, turned foul. Men slumped against wooden beams, tankards in hand, their coarse laughter punctuated by the hiss of whiskey hitting glass. Through the haze of tobacco smoke and the low, greasy glow of lanterns, they saw her. She was a wild thing, dragged into the center of the floor, a young woman, her hair a tangled storm, her eyes fierce, her chin lifted in a silent dare to a world that had tried its best to break her. Her name was Tessa, though few used it with any kindness. She couldn't have been more than 22. Rough rope bit into her wrists, binding her hands behind her back, but her posture was a silent rebellion. She wore a faded work dress and scuffed boots, the dirt caked at her wrists a testament to a life of hard labor. Her eyes, however, burned with a defiant fire. Hank McCord, bloated and florid, climbed onto a table, his beer gut straining the buttons of his shirt. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "This one," he bellowed, his voice cracking over the din, "has a tongue sharper than a razor and a will harder than iron. Can't cook, can't clean, and won't bow her head to any man. She called me out in front of my own hands. Anyone want to try taming her? Now's your chance. I'm selling her cheap. She ain't worth a damn dollar to a man who knows a woman's place." The saloon erupted in a wave of cruel laughter. A burly blacksmith took a long swallow of ale and slammed his tankard down. "A wild mare, that one. Who'd have the stones to break her?" Tessa's chest rose and fell with a steady breath, but she did not flinch. Her gaze locked onto Hank, and her voice, clear and steady, sliced through the din. "You can't teach anyone their place, Hank. You've never even learned your own." The words struck like a whip. Hank's face purpled with rage. Before anyone could move, he leaped from the table and delivered a savage slap. The crack of his hand against her cheek silenced the room. Thrown off balance, Tessa hit the floor hard, dust swirling around her like mocking spirits. Blood bloomed on her lip, but no tears fell. She pressed a hand to the splintered floorboards and pushed herself up, brushing the dirt from her mouth with the back of her bound hand. The room remained quiet now, not with respect, but with a predator's anticipation. In a shadowed corner, a man stood. Bo Dillon. He was tall, his shoulders broad and still, despite the makeshift cast wrapped around his right leg. A carved walking cane rested against the bench beside him. When he rose, the very atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. Men straightened. Whiskey glasses paused halfway to lips. He moved without a sound, a boulder settling into place, and stopped so close to Hank that the old man flinched. "How much?" Bo asked, his voice low and even. Every eye in the room swiveled to Hank. Winded from his own violence, Hank stumbled back, a sneer twisting his lips. "You? A crippled rancher with a failing spread? This filly will bore a hole through your pocket before she ever learns to boil beans." Bo didn't blink. He reached into a worn leather pouch at his belt. The crisp snap of the clasp was followed by the clean, decisive clink of silver coins rattling across the table, sliding past sticky mugs until they stopped at Hank's dirty fingers. "I don't want someone easy," Bo said, his eyes on Tessa. "I want someone with fire." Time seemed to slow. A man's laugh died in his throat. Bo knelt and, with a small knife, cut the ropes that bound Tessa's wrists. He helped her to her feet, his hand a firm, steady presence at her elbow. They stood facing each other in the center of that hostile room. She didn't smile or offer thanks, but her eyes held a flicker of recognition, a single ember glowing in the ashes. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. He simply guided her through the silent, watching crowd. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Tessa lifted her chin higher, the wind catching the wild strands of her dark hair. She walked away from the swinging doors of the saloon without a backward glance. Behind her, beside her, Beau followed. He carried a lantern, its light a steady beacon in the dark, his eyes fixed on the woman who refused to bend. And though she would never say it, something inside Tessa shifted, a quiet realization that perhaps this man, too, lived by his own rules, and would not ask her to silence hers. She walked into the night beside a stranger who had looked into her storm and offered not ownership, but something far rarer, a choice. The wagon creaked along the dusty trail as dusk draped a heavy silence over the plains. Tessa sat beside Beau, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. Though free of the ropes, the weight of humiliation clung to her like trail dust. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the town of Red Hollow. Beau's ranch was a modest spread at the edge of a shallow ridge, with a weathered barn sagging at one end. The house was simple, 2 rooms and a loft, patched with care but bare of comforts. He stopped the wagon, climbed down slowly with the help of his cane, and turned to offer her a hand. She ignored it, jumping down on her own. Inside, it smelled of cedar smoke and old leather. He simply pointed toward a wooden ladder. "Loft is yours. Bed's made. Clean towel by the basin." Then he turned and limped out, leaving her in the quiet. That night, Tessa did not cry. She lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the rafters, listening to the horses shifting in the barn. She was used to strange roofs and cold floors. But this was different. The silence was too deep, the space too clean. It felt suspicious. At dawn, she was up. She drew water, stoked the stove, and began sweeping the porch. No one told her to. She simply knew it was better to be useful. When Beau emerged, limping toward the barn, she was already scrubbing a saddle by the fence. He paused, watching her for a moment, then walked over and placed a pair of soft, worn leather gloves on the porch rail. They were small enough for her hands. "Don't work like you're hiding from a beating," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Work like you mean to stay." Tessa picked up the gloves. She said nothing, but a tiny crack appeared in the wall she had built around herself. That afternoon, as she chopped wood, she felt his eyes on her. Not judging, just watching. The swing of the axe was familiar, almost a comfort. Later, she brought him a cup of coffee as he rested by the fire. He looked up, surprised. "When did I ask for this?" he asked. She shrugged. "You paid for me." His jaw tightened. "I paid to get you away from McCord, not to own you." "Same thing to most folks," she said, her voice flat. "Not to me." Silence returned, but it was different now. Not cold, but weighted. That night, as she lay in the loft, she listened again. Not for danger, but for the sound of him moving below, the quiet hush of the wind. She didn't trust him, not yet. But she no longer feared him. And for a girl who had spent her life fighting for every inch of breath, that was a beginning. The wind swept steadily over the ridge, sending sagebrush whispering along the fence lines. Tessa now rode the property each morning, her hair tucked beneath an old trail hat, her frame straight in the saddle as if she were born to it. She moved with purpose, her voice calm and low as she worked the cattle. Bo watched from the porch, saying little, but noticing everything. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Bo was heading to the barn when he stumbled. Tessa, brushing down a horse, heard the heavy thud. She turned to see him on the ground, his cane just out of reach, cursing under his breath. She ran to him. "Don't move," he grunted. "Not like you're going anywhere." Without asking, she slipped an arm around his waist and helped him up. "Come on," she muttered, taking his weight. "You're heavier than you look." "I look heavy," he rasped, but let her guide him. It was a slow, awkward shuffle to the house, her body pressed close against his. Neither of them spoke, but a new awareness flickered between them. She helped him onto the porch bench, and his injured leg bumped the edge. He winced, gritting his teeth. "Sorry," she said, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before looking away. "Not broken," he said, his voice tight. "Just my pride." She went inside without another word. Bo watched her go, a small, surprised chuckle escaping him. Cute, he thought, and the word felt entirely new. The next morning, she found a note beside her plate. "Tessa, feed bins low. Check north fence." Her name. Not girl, not you, just Tessa. She touched the paper before tucking it away. That night, they sat by the fire, the lantern casting a low glow. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice steady and hard-earned. "My parents were killed when I was 8. I saw it happen." Bo just looked at her, his expression unchanging. "They were settlers," she continued, "too proud. One night, men came asking for water. My father let them in. I watched from under the floorboards as they burned the house. A stable hand found me days later. He put me to work. The kind of work that makes you forget your own name." The fire snapped in the hearth. She looked up, her eyes fierce and dry. "I stopped crying that year. I decided if no one was going to protect me, I'd become the kind of woman no one could break." Bo's gaze met hers, deep and still. He did not offer platitudes or pity. He offered her the respect of his silence, a simple, solid nod of understanding. And for Tessa, that was more than enough. The last traces of winter clung to the northern hills, but the ground near the house had begun to soften. A hush hung in the morning air, filled with the scent of thawed earth and wood smoke. Tessa knelt beneath the porch steps, sleeves rolled up, her fingers digging into the cold soil. She was planting small roots and seeds with the quiet care of someone rebuilding a world. Bo came around the corner, a bale of hay on his shoulder. He stopped. "You planting potatoes down there?" Tessa glanced up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Nope. Flowers, forget-me-nots, lavender, daisies if they'll take." Bo raised a brow. "Figured you for someone who only grows things you can eat." A small, real smile touched her lips. "Flowers will grow on stone if they get enough water. I just needed a patch of ground that wasn't trying to spit me out." "My mother," she went on, brushing dirt from her palms. "She loved planting. Said every flower was a letter from the earth. After she was gone, I never stayed in one place long enough to grow anything. Until now, I guess." Bo gave a slow nod, then turned and went inside. Later that evening, she found a small bundle wrapped in linen on the table. Inside was an old, yellowed paper envelope. The faded writing read, "Seeds." She looked up as Bo walked in. "These yours?" "They were my mother's," he said simply. "She saved them every spring. Said she'd plant them when the house felt right." Tessa's fingers curled around the fragile packet. "Why give them to me?" Bo looked at her, his gaze steady. Because maybe the house is finally right. Or maybe it just needed someone who knew what flowers were worth. She didn't reply, only held the seeds to her chest. A quiet promise had settled between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. In a place where nothing was supposed to grow, something had finally begun to bloom. The wind came up from the south, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Bo was chopping wood when he saw a man in a gray suit riding up the path, his boots too polished for this part of the country. The man dismounted as if he owned the land. "You Bo Dillon?" he called out. Bo nodded, his hand tightening on his cane. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas Whitfield, from the First Land and Title Bank. Just a routine check on your deed." Tessa stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a cloth, her eyes sharp. Whitfield pulled out a document. "Our records show some inconsistencies. I'll just need to see your original copy." Bo's jaw worked. He knew the land was his, but he was no man for paperwork. "I'll get it," he said slowly. "Let me see his first." Tessa's voice cut in, quiet but firm. Whitfield blinked. "It's just bank business, miss." "I can read," she replied, stepping down from the porch. "And I've seen this kind of business before." She took the paper, and her brow furrowed as she scanned it. Then she looked up. "You're not from First Land and Title. They changed this letterhead 3 years ago. And this clause here, it's a forfeiture trigger. It says if Bo signs this, he gives up his land in 60 days to repay a loan he never took." Whitfield's face hardened. "Now look here." "No," she interrupted calmly. "You look. I've seen your kind before. You prey on folks who can't read the fine print and trick them out of everything they own. Not today." She handed the paper back. "You can ride on, and I suggest you do it fast." Whitfield glared, then snatched up his satchel. "Fine. But when this place folds, don't say no one tried to help you." He rode off in a cloud of angry dust. Bo watched him go, then turned to Tessa. "How did you know all that?" "I worked on a ranch that lost everything to a man like him," she said softly. "I was just a girl, but I never forgot the words they used." Bo nodded slowly. "You're sharper than any man in a suit I've ever met." Tessa shrugged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Funny. Folks used to say I was too wild to teach, too mouthy to learn." He looked at her for a long moment, something deep and warm flickering in his eyes. Then, quiet as the breeze, he said, "Then they were fools." A comfortable silence fell between them. Inside the house, the kettle began to whistle. Tessa turned to go, her steps easy. She didn't need thanks. She hadn't done it for that. But Bo followed her in, and for the first time he poured 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. The lantern flickered low, casting golden light across the kitchen table where they sat in the evening hush. Outside, the Wyoming wind sighed through the plains, but inside it was warm, filled with a quiet companionship. Tessa sat with the ranch ledger, her hand moving with surprising precision, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Across from her, Bo traced the symbols in an old branding guide. His voice, low and steady, broke the companionable quiet. "This one here," he said, pointing. "This is the Bar T." "That one belonged to a ranch south of Casper," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's gone now." Tessa leaned in, her gaze tracing the faded mark on the leather. "It looks like a hammer and a nail." He grunted, a sound of grim agreement. "A brand is a story. Every one of these has a past, some good, some full of ghosts. She glanced up from the book, her eyes meeting his. And what does yours say? He held her gaze for a moment that stretched a little too long, then looked back down at the ledger. Mine says Dylan, built by my father's hands, burned by mine, and rebuilt slow. She didn't press him further. Instead, she turned a page, the crisp paper whispering in the quiet room. You're 6 sacks short on grain for next month. You'll need to reorder. He looked at her, a faint, amused smile touching his lips. You sound like a banker. Maybe in another life, she murmured, her eyes still on the numbers. One where my shoes matched and someone read me stories before bed. Beau's expression shifted, the amusement softening into something else, something deeper. You're sharp with numbers. It's not something most folks have ever appreciated, she said, her tone as dry as dust. I once pointed out a man's cattle count was off. He called me uppity and threw me out without a dime. Then he was a fool. She blinked, surprised by the simple, unwavering bluntness in his voice. Beau leaned forward, his elbows resting on the worn wooden table. I've had more help from you in 2 months than from 3 hired hands all of last year. You fix fences, you break horses, and you keep this place from crumbling into the dirt. And you do it all without ever asking what's in it for you. She looked down, her fingers stilling on the page. I never ask because I don't expect things to last. I always figured if I learned enough, worked hard enough, someone might finally let me stay. But they never did. Always said I was too loud, too wild, too much. Beau's eyes locked on hers, serious and steady. You're not too much. You're just more than they could handle. A silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with unspoken meaning. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Maybe people like you aren't meant to be kept. Maybe you're meant to be chosen. She looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. Chosen? He gave a single, firm nod. By someone who sees all of you, not just the pieces they think they want. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, Is that what you see? He held her gaze. I see someone who was born for more than what the world ever gave her. A soft blush rose to her cheeks, and she looked away, suddenly unsure of what to say. After a beat, he added with a small, tentative smile, Do you mind if I call you Tess? She turned back to him, confused. Tess? It's shorter, he said with a slight shrug. Softer, maybe. I figured you deserved something gentle for once. A soft laugh escaped her, a surprised, quiet sound. No one's ever shortened my name before. They usually just shout it. Well, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting into a genuine smile. I'm not shouting. She paused, searching his face, and then nodded. All right, Tess. He tapped the ledger lightly with a calloused finger. You missed a number on that last row. She rolled her eyes and leaned back over the book, the blush still faint on her cheeks. I did not. You did, he said, still grinning. They sat like that for a long while, the fire crackling in the hearth, the prairie wind moaning softly in the distance. Two people who had never been taught how to belong, slowly, hesitantly, finding a way. And as she corrected the line in the ledger, Beau sat quietly watching her, thinking that sometimes the strongest people were the ones who had learned to walk through fire and still found the strength to grow wildflowers from the ashes. The morning dawned in shades of gray, veiled in the kind of quiet that sits heavy in the air right before a storm. Dew clung to the blades of grass like tiny pearls, and the breeze was soft but restless. Tessa walked slowly across the pasture, a satchel slung over her shoulder, her boots damp from the mist. Behind her, the ranch lay still, a faint wisp of smoke curling from the chimney, the windmill creaking its lonely song in the distance. She had left a note on the kitchen table, folded neatly beside Beau's coffee mug. 4 words, written in her small, precise script. Thank you for letting me survive. No tear stains, no long goodbyes. It was the kind of message left by someone who never expected more than a warm place to sleep and a moment to catch her breath. Tessa didn't cry. Her eyes were dry, her breath steady, but with every step, the weight in her chest grew heavier. Because even though she told herself it was time to move on, that she had earned her keep and nothing more, a part of her heart had begun to root itself in the very dirt she had once thought too hard to ever call home. She reached a shallow creek at the base of the ridge, the water glinting like dark glass as it slipped over the stones. She sat on a flat rock, unslung her satchel, and stared down into the moving current. There was no sound but the birds and her own heartbeat, and then the thud of hooves on damp earth. She heard them long before she saw him. Beau's horse slowed on the ridge above. His silhouette against the pale sky was unmistakable. Tall, broad-shouldered, one knee still held stiffly in the saddle. He dismounted with a practiced slowness, wincing slightly as his boot hit the ground. For a long second, he just stood there, watching her. Then he started down the slope. Tessa stayed seated, her arms folded over her knees, not turning to face him. When he was close enough to see the worried crease between her brows, he spoke, his voice soft. You left before breakfast. She didn't answer. He looked around, at the satchel, the empty space beside her, the raw silence hanging in the air. Did you really think I hired you just to muck out stalls? That made her look up. I don't think anyone hires someone like me for anything else, she replied, her voice flat. I was trouble the day I arrived, and a burden every day I stayed. I just figured it was time to stop pretending this was ever meant to be permanent. Pretending what? That this was meant to last. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she bit her lip hard. Beau stepped closer. From his coat pocket, he pulled a faded square of cloth, worn with age, but still folded neatly. He held it out to her. Tessa blinked. What is that? You left it behind, your first day, he said. I found it under the stairs. Could have tossed it, but I kept it. Why? Because I figured someday, he said, his voice low and steady, I'd need something to remind you that you belonged here. She stared at the cloth. It was her mother's handkerchief, stitched with tiny blue flowers. It was the one thing she had carried through every rough place, every beating, every hard morning. The one thing she thought she had lost forever. Her lips trembled. You kept it, all this time? He nodded once. Because from the moment you stood your ground in that broken-down barn, I knew you weren't just passing through. You're the kind of woman a man builds a home around, if he's lucky enough to deserve it. She shook her head, her breath catching in her throat. Men don't keep someone like me. No, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You're someone a man follows, if he has the spine for it. Tessa stood slowly. The creek whispered beside them, and the wind brushed her cheek like a question. Bo extended his hand. He didn't promise her forever. He didn't beg her to stay. He just offered, calm and steady, the same way he approached wild colts, broken tools, and every hard thing that ever needed patience. Tessa looked from his calloused fingers up to his face, and slowly, wordlessly, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were rough from work, so were his. But together, they fit. He squeezed her hand once, not to hold, not to trap, but just to say, "I'm here." She did not cry, not yet. But in that moment, by the creek and the rocks, with the sky turning to gold above them, she knew. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live. Summer rolled across the plains in a haze of golden dust and the drone of humming bees, and Wildflower Ridge came into its full bloom. The ranch was no longer a quiet, half-forgotten place tucked against the hills. It pulsed with life. Cattle grazed lazily across wide pastures. The fences stood tall and tight, and the garden behind the cabin overflowed with color. Lavender, forget-me-nots, and daisies swayed in the heat, their fragrance drifting on the wind. Tessa rode the fence line each morning, her hat pulled low, a long braid swinging behind her. She barked commands, patched brakes, and pulled calves from thorny traps. By noon, she would return with dust on her boots and a fierce spark in her eye. The hands in town started calling her Miss Tess who rides like thunder, though none of them dared try to keep pace. She was no longer just helping Bo. She was running the ranch with him. They never made an announcement. They never needed to. But the way she walked beside him at the general store, her hand brushing his, the way he passed her a tool without having to ask, the way she handed him his coffee every sunrise with the quiet smile of someone who had finally made peace with herself. The truth of it was as clear as the creek water. One warm evening, with crickets chirping their nightly song, and the sun hanging low like a golden coin in the west, Bo saddled his horse and gave a low whistle. She met him outside the barn, a curious look on her face. "Planning on running off?" she asked, a playful glint in her eyes. "Only if you're coming with me." She arched a brow. "And where are we headed?" "You'll see." They rode side by side, their horses' hooves kicking up soft clouds of dust. The trail wound past the southern field and over the small ridge where wildflowers bloomed thickest in the spring. It had been Tessa's idea to scatter seeds there. The soil was rocky, the hill half barren, but she had said it deserved something beautiful. Now, in the golden light of dusk, that hill was ablaze with color. Bo dismounted and tied his horse. She followed his lead. Together, they climbed the last slope on foot, their boots crushing wild petals and releasing their sweet scent into the air. At the top, they stood in silence. The flowers brushed against their knees. The wind moved through them like a hymn. In the distance, the ranch lay quiet and golden, safe under their shared care. Bo cleared his throat. "You said something once," he began, his voice rough, "about flowers being able to grow on stone." Tessa turned to him. "I did?" He looked at her, his gaze steady and calm. "It got me thinking. If flowers can grow on stone, maybe love can too." She didn't speak, just watched him. Every wall she had ever built inside herself trembling, but not falling. Bo took a slow breath. "So where does it grow, Tess? Love, I mean." A soft smile touched her lips. one that held everything she had been and all he had become. "It grows in people," she said, her voice quiet but sure, "who aren't afraid of where they came from, even the parts that hurt." His eyes dropped for just a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a piece of leather, worn and curved with age. It was the old horse rein he had carried since he was a boy, the first one he had ever carved himself, and burned into the center was a single letter, T. "I don't have a ring," he said, his voice low and honest. "Never figured I'd have a reason to get one." He stepped closer and held it out. "But this has followed me longer than any man or woman. Through war, through storms, it's the only thing I ever trusted to hold steady." Tessa stared at the simple strip of leather, her throat tightening. "I want it to follow you now," Bo said, "if you'll let it." She didn't answer right away. She just reached out, her calloused, sun-browned fingers brushing his. She took the leather, looped it gently around her wrist, and then met his eyes. "You never tried to tame me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "No," he murmured back. "You're not something to be tamed. You just stood beside me." He nodded. "That's the only way I want it," he said. "Beside you. Always." They stood like that long after the sun dipped below the ridge. There were no vows, no preacher, just the flowers, the wind, and two souls who had finally stopped running. From that day forward, folks didn't call it the Dillon Ranch anymore. They called it Wildflower Ridge, not just for the blooms on the hill, but for the woman who taught them how to grow. Tessa rode beside Bo every day after that, through storm and through sun, through every broken fence and every new birth in the barn. And when strangers came through and asked who ran the place, the townsfolk would say, "She does, the girl no man could keep." "But someone did?" the strangers would ask. "No," they'd reply with a knowing smile. "Someone chose her, and she chose him back." If that story touched your heart, if you felt the dust in the wind, the fire in her eyes, and the quiet strength of a man who chose not to tame but to stand beside, then you're in the right place. At Wild West Love Stories, we bring you tales of love that rise from the hardest ground. Stories where hearts heal, where strong women and silent men find something worth holding on to, and where even the wildest souls find a home. So if you believe in that kind of love, the kind you fight for, the kind you ride beside, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share this story with someone who still believes in real, raw romance. And remember, out here in the West, love was never meant to be tame. Subscribe now to never miss a heartbeat from Wild West Love Stories.